Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and all of us at Books and Books in Miami, Florida, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Julia Cooke to discuss her new book, Come Fly the World, the jet age story of the women of Pan Am, a riveting, complex portrait of the adventurous lives of Pan Am stewardesses during aviation's golden age. Julia Cooke is a journalist and travel writer whose features and personal essays have been published in Time, Smithsonian, Condé Nast Traveler, and Saveur. She is the author of The Other Side of Paradise, Life in the New Cuba. The daughter of a former Pan Am executive, Julia grew up in the Pan Am family, a still strong network across the globe. She now lives in Vermont, from where she joins us today. Julia is literally going to fly solo tonight for her presentation, but we'll have some time for audience questions at the end. So please post your questions anytime during the broadcast in the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. I'll take a moment to remind you that you can order your copy of Come Fly the World from Books and Books Below by pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Julia to the stage. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Christina.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'll see you soon.
It's a little different from the last time I was at Books and Books for a reading, but it's also fitting to be virtually in Miami on International Women's Day. Miami was ground zero for Pan Am, where the airline began in South Florida. So it feels right. I'd like to talk for a few minutes. I have one short reading that I'll get to after introducing the book a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about my research a little bit. And then I'd love to have some questions from you guys out there. If other events have been a guide, we have a fair amount of real stewardesses or more recent flight attendants in the audience. I hope so. And I'd love to hear from you too. What airline you worked for, what years, where you were based. It's been really fun at other events to hear about that. So broadly, Come Fly the World is about the international stewardesses of Pan Am. I use the word stewardesses intentionally because the book is about the women who worked for the airline and for a couple of airlines in the era in which that was the word that was used. In its day, Pan Am was the only American airline that flew exclusively international routes, which means that if you get on a Pan Am plane, you were getting off in a foreign country. So that was what really was so exciting to me about Pan Am. I think that's what also was incredibly exciting about Pan Am to the women who worked on the airline. The book is about the places that these women flew to. It's about the way that they moved through the world, the work culture of the airline, and also the largely unseen role that the women played in the Vietnam War. More specifically, Come Fly the World is about the lives of 5 women and their time flying. It's about how flying impacted the choices that they made. It's about how it impacted the lives that they led. It's also about the fun they had, the challenges they faced and overcame, the places they visited, and what they did in those places. One reviewer of the book in an early review said that it reads like a novel, but it was really important to me that the book would be about real women doing real things, backed up by real research and put in the context of an incredibly tumultuous time in American history. I came to the book in an interesting way. My dad worked for Pan Am, but I really hadn't thought a huge amount about the airline until I was walking down the street in New York and chatting with my husband about Pan Am. And he said, maybe you should think about what's going on with Pan Am now. Where are these people? So I looked up the Pan Am Historical Foundation. I hadn't really had anything to do with them prior to that. And I saw that they were hosting an event at someplace that I'd always wanted to tour. It was the TWA terminal at JFK in New York. The Pan Am terminal has been torn down, but the TWA terminal is still standing, and it's actually it's now a hotel. So I had been living in New York and writing a lot about art and architecture, and I was really excited to go tour the TWA terminal. I just wanted to see it. It was built by Eero Saarinen in the 50s. It's a beautiful, beautiful structure. I went to this event and I met these two women who were magnetic. They were former flight crew. They were stewardesses, they told me. They were not flight attendants. And I was intrigued by that correction. I thought it was telling. It seemed to me to be pinning them to an era and a job that was important and was very different from the role of flight attendant today. So that difference I found really compelling. I was also I found the women magnetic. They were lively, they were funny. They talked about events of geopolitics and global history with a sort of casual intimacy, as if they'd either conferred with prime ministers or had martinis with spies. And to be honest, some of them had. I found them fascinating, and I wanted to know exactly how they'd become who they were. I wrote the book because the more of these women I met, I started going to Pan Am Historical Foundation events and meeting more and more of these former stewardesses. And the more I met in that first phase of research, the more I sensed that these women were never really given their rightful place in the history of restless, world-changing women, largely because the pop culture of the image that was kind of foisted upon them. They were trailblazing women whose lives really reflected the changes of the era, and who also really changed the era in a lot of ways. And I didn't feel like that had been truly understood. I am a restless woman. I like to travel. I love traveling. I find it's where I feel most comfortable. And I felt a kinship with these women, and I felt like they had really opened doors for me on a generational level. And I wondered why that had never really been credited. So the book explains in a lot of ways why that is, and attempts to place them where they belong in history. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading, very short reading from the book. This is from chapter 1, in which readers will meet a woman named Lynn. Lynn is finishing up her last year at SUNY Oswego. She's going to graduate with a science degree. She's been working in a couple of labs, but she's really not loving it. Not because she doesn't find the work interesting. She finds the work very compelling, but being in labs is not thrilling to her. She's more of an extrovert than that. And she's also vaguely intimidated by the men in the labs. She doesn't really love being the only woman or one of two women in the science labs. So she also starts to learn about the Vietnam War via a boyfriend of hers at the time, and starts to get a little more politically engaged. Her last year of college, she goes to Rome, and when she gets to Rome, it's like her world explodes. She decides that she wants to be out in the world. So she comes back home and has an idea that she floats to her parents that she wants to become a stewardess. And this section that I'm going to read right now, it explains a little bit of why that was such an exciting job for her. Working as a stewardess gave a woman the ability to see different places, and also to experience who she could be against those varied backdrops. This invitation to try out an unfettered version of oneself somewhere else had appealed to enormous numbers of women from the start of the commercial airline industry. Sadie in New York read a 1936 profile in the Chicago Sunday Tribune of a stewardess who had beaten out hundreds of other women for a spot on a United shuttle, is a very different person from Sadie in Chicago. In Chicago, Sadie Erickson lived, quote, a life of considerable dash, biking, swimming, roller skating, and shopping. But twice a week, her job took her to New York, and New York Sadie was a different sort of woman. As soon as she arrived there, she bought 2 books, one fiction, one nonfiction, and a supply of magazines. She stocked her hotel room with a pound of chocolates and a half-dozen apples, and she had her meals sent up, as she read, stretched across the hotel room bed in her dressing gown. A decade earlier, when air travel was raw and new, cabin attendants in the established model of train stewards had been men. But in 1930, a nurse and trained pilot approached an airline executive to convince him that nurses would make better cabin crew. The pitch worked. A nurse could more naturally reassure a fearful passenger, the executive wrote in a memo, or minister to airsick men. Quote, "The passengers relax," reported an Atlantic Monthly writer. "If a mere girl isn't worried, why should they be?" In the mid-1930s, a stewardess had dragged 2 passengers from the burning wreckage of a Pennsylvania crash that killed 12. Though she was injured herself, she ran 4 miles for help. Front-page articles celebrated her as a heroine. Profiles of other women and their crews, friendships, and habits appeared across newspapers and magazines. Quote, "Air hostess finds life adventurous," read one front-page headline in the New York Times. Indeed, Sadie Erickson was a model of the duality expected of stewardesses. She had social skills and self-determination, glamour and grit. The petite blonde looked, quote, "like a captivating French doll and was, quote, almost magnetically endowed by looks, temperament, and education to be outstanding in a profession that required, quote, poise and fearless capacity for action and grim courage." The next 2 decades consolidated the view of the job as women's work. During the Second World War, women took cabin positions across airlines as men served in the military. Passengers began to favor air travel over ocean or rail in the post-war 1950s, due in part to technological advances such as the jet plane that sliced a trip across the Atlantic down to 6 or 10 hours, depending on whether there were tail or headwinds. Airlines competed for passengers by touting technical innovations, but only so many customizations to the new jet plane existed. Prices were stabilized by the government at $400 or $500 to cross the Atlantic, so flying was too expensive to be a regular undertaking for anyone but the rich. Each airline tried to convince customers that it had the highest level of luxury and service, and the women, who served a predominantly male clientele, became a particular selling point. And then there are a couple of pages detailing the glamour of the era of air travel, some of the couturiers who designed uniforms for the women, the gold carpet that was rolled across the tarmac, and more. And it also details a little bit of the contradictory danger that these stewardesses were placed in, hijackings and war flights. And then it returns a little bit to the women to conclude this section. In the United States, the cabin of an international airplane was a sought-after workplace for young, unmarried, mostly white women. Airlines in the 1960s hired only 3 to 5% of applicants. Base pay was commensurate with other acceptably feminine roles. Nurse, teacher, librarian, secretary. Perks included insurance, free air travel, paid vacation, and stipends on layovers. Layovers in themselves were extraordinary. A decade earlier, solitary international travel was rarely undertaken by a woman who could not leverage high social status to excuse her lack of chaperone. And most women had married long before their mid-20s. In the 1950s, only a third of American women were still single at age 24. Some years, more teenage girls walked down the aisle than attended prom. The women applying for stewardess positions in the 1960s had, in the 1950s, been forbidden to wear pants in high school, and sometimes even in college. Now, during layovers, a stewardess could pull off the skirt of her uniform, put on slacks, and chaperone-free sashay around the museums of the 16th arrondissement. She could wear jeans and wander through Mexican markets. Flight routes, experience, and expertise varied by airline. But having a job on any plane was a reason for a woman to roam. What was revolutionary was the lack of should in this job, the plenitude of could. So that explains a little bit of why the role was such a sought-after position for the young women who applied for the job. On Pan Am, the requirements were physical. They had to be between 5'3" and 5'9", a certain weight, and they had to be quite pretty. They were subjected to pretty excruciatingly detailed assessments of their appearance by the interviewers. They also had to be quite smart. They were college educated. They spoke 2 languages. So this was a pretty select group of women, people who, like Lynn, whose parents may not have reacted with such pleasure when they told them that they were going to become airline stewardesses, people whose parents had thought that they wanted them to be more. They wanted them to pursue perhaps professional degrees. But for the women who took the job, they were really, the world beckoned, and the opportunity to get out in it was just huge. It was too much of a temptation. So over the course of writing and researching this book, I learned a lot. I learned packing tips, which are in the book. I learned what foods for a dinner party fly the best across the Atlantic Ocean and across the African continent. If you're trying to host a dinner party in Monrovia, what do you want to bring? I learned about how the lawsuits that stewardesses brought forth against the airlines that hired them set the legal precedent for the employment law that my generation of women enjoys. I learned about how airlines constructed the glamour of the jet age, why we consider the jet age so glamorous. Some of it was constructed by the way that the airlines hired these couturiers and served the foods on Pan Am in particular. Menus were designed by Maximes of Paris, and the food was quite good. They had airline terminals and corporate headquarters that were designed by the best architects of the era. But a lot of the glamour was also about the women who wore those uniforms. I think that the conclusion that I came to over the course of the book was that they really didn't fit any kind of stereotyped mold. They existed in a middle ground between feminine and feminist. They were both things at once in an era in which that was not really, it was not very legible. They really did enjoy the new freedoms of the day, all of them, and that was remarkable. The conclusions that I came to, and this is what compelled me so much about them, was that they anticipated a lot of the changes that would happen much later. They anticipated a global marketplace. They were buying their shoes in Rome and hose in Paris and pearls in Hong Kong, in an era in which it was only they who had access to those things from those places. They couldn't go to a department store in New York and buy the same things at the same prices from the same places. They anticipated third wave feminism. From my perspective, they really seemed like third wave feminists in a second wave era. They anticipated the soft diplomacy of a much later era. They were cultural diplomats everywhere. And they were fascinating. So that's why it was so important to me to focus on real women. And to do that, I focused on specifically 5 women. 3 women's stories form the backbone of the book. They all meet at the end of the book for Operation Baby Lift, which was a refugee flight in 1975. One of them began her career with the U.S. Army as well, as being on these Vietnam War flights. She worked at a service club in Germany, in the peacetime army. So I'm going to show you a couple of things that I leaned on when I was doing my research. This is Karen in her army uniform. And these are some of the letters that Karen sent me from Ulm to her family. So I got to look at all of her. She sent me all of the letters that her mom had saved from that era. These letters date from 1965 through the 70s. She sent her tons of letters. I have this huge stack right here, which I found fascinating and incredible to read through. So I got to interview Karen, but also see exactly what she was thinking, and or if not thinking, what she was telling her parents from each one of these places, which was incredible to be able to ask her, both to jog her memory, to ask her questions about different places and, what she was doing when, but also to see how she was presenting what she was doing back then. These were letters, some of the letters that were written in the second chapter that focuses on Karen when she begins to fly and starts, moving around the world. I have letters from Israel, from Rome, from Lebanon, from Hong Kong, from all over the place. And some of these letters were written in the bathtubs of hotel rooms. If you're a former flight crew in the audience, you know what I'm talking about. This is before the women got their own hotel rooms they shared with other women. And Karen would go into the bathroom and write letters home. And then in the last section about Karen, well, the second to last, this is the one in which the women all meet. This is Karen on Operation Baby Lift. These are photos that she took. She had always dreamed of becoming a writer and a journalist, and she did. She wrote about Operation Baby Lift for the Missoulian. This is the clip from the newspaper from 1975. And she wrote about the experience for her newspaper, which kickstarted a second career for her. She both flew and wrote for a couple of years, and then she was able to quit flying to pursue writing full time. So I leaned on all of that for the personal side of things, and then I looked at books like this book, The Fall of Saigon by David Butler, which was incredible. You can see it's pretty dog-eared and has tons of post-it notes from all the sections that I looked at harder to help bolster what I was hearing about. I felt very strongly that I wanted everything that I included in the book to be verified. Either the scene was, I would include something only if it was told to me by two different women in the same way, that they have the same memory of the same event, from two different people, or if I could confirm the details that someone told me via a book like the Butler book. So that's how I tried to make as sure as I could that everything in the book is completely factually accurate. Of course, nothing is perfect, but I did the best I could. So with that, I would love to hear what some of you are thinking, and if there are any questions, I would love to hear them. Christina?
Here I am.
Awesome.
Hi. That was fascinating. Oh my gosh. I have some questions, but there's one here waiting. Hang on. It's from Pat, and she says, I used to fly more years ago, and all the flight attendants I've met were really great people. Was that your experience? Looking forward to reading the book.
Thanks. Honestly, it was another, I got a question a little bit ago, which reminded me that I had a real ulterior motive when I started doing this work. I wanted to know how they had done it. These women, one of the women that I met at the TWA terminal, one of the first women, she said that she never bought a return ticket home because you never know. She was so spontaneous and so interesting. They seemed to have really lived their lives so fully. And their friendships were incredible. They have these bonds that are really amazing. They still travel together. They visit one another. They're the godparents to each other's children. It's remarkable to look at them. And coming from the perspective of then I was in my early 30s, now I'm in my late 30s. I really wanted to learn from them about how to get older. And I think I did learn a lot. It certainly really impacted my friendships. I invest a lot more in my women friends than I did, perhaps. I think I took them more for granted. And now I think I try a little harder, and we make time for trips a little more than we otherwise would have. It's hard, but we work at it. But the point is that they were, yes, I found them. So many of them had these incredible backstories and continued to live these incredible lives and were really remarkable people.
So here's a question from Katrina. And she would like to know, how did the women feel about their beauty requirements? Did they resent these standards or saw them as a ticket to something bigger? Great question.
Almost neither. I think they just kind of took them for granted. And for the most part, the women that I talked to understood that they were just part of the deal. What they did chafe at was when the airlines began to really overtly sexualize them. And Pan Am was not that sort of. Pan Am had some ads that were a little bit sexist. They have an ad that's in the book that has a picture of an airplane tail, and it says grab life by the tail or something. It's a little innuendo there, but some of the other airlines were really, really overt about it. There was the National Airlines Fly Me campaign. Braniff had an ad campaign that was the airstrip. They had their stewardesses getting on a plane wearing multiple layers, and over the course of the flight, they would take off their one layer of clothing in flight until they were wearing pretty scanty outfits. And on Southwest, they were famously wearing hot pants, and they served love potions and love bites instead of drinks and meals. So that was what, when their beauty was kind of weaponized in a way, or commodified for corporate gain. Some of them really had an issue with that, but then some of them enjoyed it in a way. And again, this is not my field of expertise. This is not the focus of the book, because the book focuses on Pan Am stewardesses, and Pan Am did not. Part of the reason why Pan Am didn't really, their uniforms were always pretty conservative. They were fashionable, but they didn't show a lot of leg or anything. They wore jackets and blouses and skirts because Pan Am was flying internationally. So the cultural, the sexual cultural mores were not loosening all around the world and in all of the places that Pan Am was flying to. So these outfits that were scanty would not read the same way in Paris and Tehran, for example, or New Delhi. So Pan Am's women were generally pretty, modestly dressed. But on the other airlines, in some of the interviews that I read, some of the women really enjoyed wearing the miniskirts. They felt like it was part of an era, and they felt like it was brand new to be able to wear something short for yourself, to date and have sex for you, and not for trying to find a husband or trying to pin someone down or whatever. It was new. And so, that was one of the things that I found so compelling about, not only Pan Am stewardesses, but everyone, all of the women who took this job. They were really, they weren't coffee, tea, or me women. They were not that stereotype by any stretch. But they didn't necessarily, they weren't prudes either.
Yeah, it sounds like it must have been such a fun job. I am old enough to remember wanting to be a stewardess. So here's a question from Ada. When did the flight attendant job become open to men, and how did that happen? Did it start in the US or in other countries? Did the salary become more competitive when men also became flight attendants?
So it had been open to men until the mid-'60s. It was in the mid-'60s that across all airlines, they basically understood that women were going to sell more, that women could become this selling feature of the airlines. And that was when they stopped hiring men. And then in 1972, that was when a lawsuit was decided that a man brought against Pan Am, in fact, and that that changed it. So again, men had to be allowed to be hired from then on out. I don't think it had any impact on salaries. It just and some men, very few, had been being hired throughout. It was never, or at least on Pan Am, it wasn't explicitly stated that it was a company policy only to hire women, but it was pretty rare.
So we have a question from TK who would like to know, why did you decide on this subject, and how did you find your main interview subjects?
So I decided on this subject of, I think you're referring to, so the women in general, because I wanted to know how they had acquired these incredibly sophisticated, incredibly knowledgeable attitudes that had so impressed me when I first met them. I began to focus more on war flights, in part because I felt like that was such the most drastic contrast that you could find between the perception of the job, which is that it was, for flighty women who wanted to meet men and go on dates and go shopping. In reality, the reality was so far from that. And I felt like the war flights, which were incredibly dangerous, these women were put in positions, they were flying into active war zones. They were transporting soldiers to a really dangerous war. Many of those soldiers did not want to go to that war. This was when the draft was still active and happening. So they were really fraught and truly dangerous flights. And so to me, that contrast was really rich, and that's what I wanted to explore. I found the women just one after another. I started going to the Pan Am Historical Foundation events, and then I started going to World Wings International events, which is the Association of Former Pan Am Flight Crew. And then, when I met, I basically, at these events, it's really interesting. The women would come up to me and say, oh, you've got to meet so-and-so. She has an incredible story about whatever. And then I would meet so-and-so, and she would indeed have an incredible story about whatever. And I would take note of that, and it would be amazing. And then I would, they would all introduce me to friends of theirs. And pretty soon I realized that I wanted to find 3 or more women who had all worked on the same flight to kind of triangulate that experience through various viewpoints. And that was when I sent out emails. I had 2 at some point, and then I sent out emails to everyone I knew and said, I'm looking for someone else who crewed on this flight. Tell me, who can you find? And lo and behold, I found someone else.
Did you use the archives or anything at the University of Miami?
Yeah, I spent a ton of time at the archives. I think
Christina. If she's here,
Christina and Nicola have been incredible. They were amazing at I had never done a ton of. I'd done a little bit of archival research in graduate school, but it was not my forte. Most of my other work had been reporting. So, there was a place that I could go to and take notes and talk to people and then walk away and feel like I would do some, research for my previous book about youth culture in Cuba. I did a lot of historical research, but it was mostly secondary sources. It was actually all secondary sources. I don't think I went to any archives for that. So I'd spent some time in archives, but I really hadn't. I was pretty green, and Christina was very gracious.
Yeah, we're talking about the special collections at the University of Miami.
Yes.
And our friend is Christina Favretto, who heads the collections there. So Kendall would like to know, and I'm not sure, did you fly for Pan Am?
I did not. No, I was 9 when the airline went under.
He was asking what years did you fly for Pan Am, but I don't
0. I flew on Pan Am a lot when I was a little kid.
Oh my God, that's great. So I would love to know more about martinis with spies.
So okay.
How did that happen?
So at the end of the Vietnam War, I mean, all throughout the Vietnam War, these women were in and out of Saigon, and Saigon was, rife with American operatives of all sorts, covert and, army people and contractors and especially at the end of the war, a lot of the flights were through Hong Kong and through Bangkok, and a lot of the people who were, I guess, the CIA agents, but not necessarily overtly declared as such, were also in those places. So the women who were spending time, you would just socialize around the pool or at the bar at the hotel and wind up meeting people. One of my main subjects told me about, there's also the fact that Air America was a branch of the CIA. It was the CIA's airline, and Air America operated, the Air America pilots were always around also. So they were just in the milieu. One of my main subjects told me about what she looked back on, understanding that she had been taking messages for a CIA agent. She would socialize with him, like they would go get a drink when she was in Hong Kong, I think, either Hong Kong or Bangkok. In Bangkok, they would have drinks at the Intercontinental Hotel, and he would say to her, "Hey, when you get to Hong Kong, go have a drink with my friend. He'll be there at so and so, and could you just let him know that I'm gonna be a little bit late doing this? I'll do this at this time, and I'll meet him here and do this." And she would go and relay the message to this other person. And looking back on it, she was like, "Huh, I think that was not what I thought it was."
Oh my God, how amazing. So here's a question about any stories about hijackings?
Yes. So I didn't have none of the women that I profiled were on a plane that was hijacked. But one of them, Tori, she got to the airport. She missed it by nothing. She got to JFK. So hijackings, a little bit of context. Hijackings back then, this was the golden era of hijackings in the late 60s. They were not, for a brief period of time, they happened with incredible frequency and no fatalities. So they were kind of seen as a novelty. Most of the time, the hijackers would get on the plane and make a threat and ask for the plane to go to Cuba in a lot of cases. Not always, but sometimes, a lot of times, the planes would wind up in Havana. And they would have to stay overnight. And so the passengers would be treated to a night in a hotel room and sometimes a cabaret. They'd go to the Tropicana. So people almost looked forward to, for a very brief period of time, these hijackings. Time magazine published an amazing relic that everyone should Google and read, what to do when the hijacker comes. It's like a tongue-in-cheek travel guide to Havana, based on being on a hijacked plane. So Tori was flying in this era out of JFK, and she got to the airport and was told that the flight that she was supposed to be on, she was switched to, and the shuttle that was an hour later. These were shuttles to Miami, and while she was in the air, the pilot called her into the cockpit and said, "You were supposed to be on flight 218, right?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Lucky you weren't on it. We just heard that it's heading to Havana." And she said, "I wish I'd been on it," because she'd always wanted to go and tour Cuba. So not everyone, and pretty soon the hijackings took a turn. They did become much more dangerous.
Right.
And then no one looked forward to them anymore.
At what point did stewardesses become flight attendants?
Late 70s, early 80s. Once it was no longer stewards and stewardesses, they sought a more gender neutral term.
Okay, we have a question from Karen. Do you describe the women's personal lives outside of when they were flying? How they live or how they spend time during layovers?
Definitely. Yeah. One of the things that I found so interesting was the way that the women behaved so differently. They really wanted to do different things on the ground in these different places. So, for example, one of the women that in the book really is a very social creature. Even to this day, she has an incredible network of friends. She's incredibly social. So she would go so on Guam, for example, she would go to the officers club for dinner, and she would, play card games all night, and they would go dancing, and she loved crew parties. So that her experience of these different places was much more social. She, if she, she was a tourist, but with other people, she would go places always in a group. Not always, but most of the time. And then another woman, also named Karen, she was much more of she really liked to do things by herself. She loved just walking around the different cities that she landed in. So she had these routines that she would follow in each city. And because she wanted to be a writer, she would have her notepad with her everywhere, and she would take notes. She would take herself out to lunch or dinner and just be writing the whole time and taking notes and reading books. And her experience of a place was much more independent. I mean, they're both pretty independent. They're both incredibly independent women. So that's the wrong terminology, but she was by herself. So they explored different cities in different ways. And the book also does, talk about the lives that they lived around their flight, their flights. One of the things that really intrigued me was what was it like to be a woman whose job kept you away from home for so much of the year? How did that shift or change or condition your personal relationships back home, both with family and with significant others? So it does include that as well.
Any plans for this to become a TV series or anything in the world of film?
Yeah, and I'm starting to talk to people about that. I hope so. It would be amazing.
Well, this is a fantastic book. So I just want to remind everyone that's watching that you can order it by just pressing the green button, and we'll ship it right out to you. If you're in Miami and you want to come by one of our stores, we're carrying it as well. And then I have Christina Favretto letting you know, please tell Julia that she's one of our favorite researchers. She brought us chocolates on top of being delightful in every way. So there you go. So I think that is it for questions. If you'd like to say do like a little reading or just wrap things up a little bit, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. So let me see. I'm not sure what to read.
I love the writing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It was really fun to be to be reading and researching about especially feminism and the way that the feminist movement was moving through that era, and then watching the changes of the era change these women's lives. Like it was a feedback loop in a way, that the women's lives were changing, even as they were changing. They were propelling those changes in the broader public, if that makes sense. They were choosing to be much more independent and to to marry at later ages. And then I was looking at, I would look at the statistics for marriage and see that they were part of a much broader, a much wider, a bigger phenomenon than even they realized. But that they were making those changes happen. So that's what I found incredible.
Did the women have to retire at a certain age, or was this like a long-term career for a lot of them, or what did they go on to do if they
That's
did?
a great question, and I'm so glad you asked that, because that is necessary for wrapping up this talk. Of course, I have to get to that before signing off. Yeah, so basically, this cohort of women, the women who worked for the airlines in this era, are the reason that it changed from being a 2-year stint in the airlines to a profession, a job that women and men could hold for as long as they wanted to. What happened was that at the beginning, in the 60s, at the beginning of the book's time period, in the 60s, the rule was that you had to retire upon getting married or turning either 32 or 35 on the different airlines. Pan Am didn't often, anecdotally, I heard that they did not often use that option. They didn't really often fire the women who turned 35, as long as women continued performing their job well and still looked good, they could keep working. But even that phrase should reveal the truly sexist nature of that rule. The women were asked to stay young. They were required to stay young, both to keep appealing to the male passengers, and also because it was cheaper. They didn't have dependents. For their health insurance costs were low if they were single and young, and they weren't necessarily speaking up for themselves or like acting out on their rights, acting upon what they really deserved. So that's why the airlines wanted them to be young. Now the women wanted to keep their jobs. They didn't necessarily have a problem with a certain level of, it wasn't that they had an issue with the sexism or the objectification that this entailed. That was not necessarily, even though some of them did, that was not necessarily what these lawsuits were about. The lawsuits, and this is what I found so interesting, that the lawsuits were about women not wanting to quit. They just wanted to keep doing their job. They just wanted to keep flying. Mm-hmm. And so, they took the airlines to court to dismantle those age ceilings, and dismantle the regulation that they had to quit if they got married, and eventually dismantle the regulation that stated that they couldn't be pregnant, couldn't have children. They were also, the assumption was that you only get pregnant if you're married. So by not allowing women to get married, they thought they were keeping women from getting pregnant also, which clearly we all know is not the case. But they just, soon, if they dismantled the regulation against marriage, then they also had to be allowed to have children. So this, one by one, these regulations were, attacked and fell. And so those lawsuits actually set the labor law precedent for a lot of the women's rights, women's employment law that followed it in the later 70s. But most importantly, to the women that I profiled, it meant that they could keep flying, and it meant that they, that the job changed from being a 2-year stint that women pursued for a little bit before settling down, to really a profession.
It was very interesting when you spoke about their anticipating diplomacy to a certain extent, or a style of diplomacy, how they were cultural diplomats.
They really were. Yeah. So basically, because Pan Am was this international airline that was really intertwined with the U.S. government, Pan Am Pan Am was very involved in World War II, and it airlifted orphans and in the Korean War, and then it also flew these soldiers out to Vietnam in the Vietnam War. So in part because of that, and then in part just because of the flight routes, as an international airline, it was and as some would argue, the premier international airline of the era, the passengers, the clientele was so varied, and the women were taught. Speaking of Christina and the Miami archives, the manuals in Miami are absolutely amazing. They're incredible to look at. in part because they cover such a wide range of information. The women were taught in training to how to, for example, the manuals have representations of each of all the fraternal organizations' pins. The women were taught to look for, Mason's pin, and if there were two people on board wearing the same pin, they were told to introduce them in flight. And they were taught to recognize that they were taught the different culinary traditions of the different places that they were flying to, and how they should be serving people differently on different flights. So, and they were all of these. The common thread in that section of the training really was diplomacy. And they were told that they were diplomats, that they were representing the United States in the air, and that they needed to behave as such. And they were expected to, what we would call and they were also told how to calm passengers down who were anxious at flying because flying was new, a relatively new technology. It was new, certainly, for huge amounts of the public. So they were told how to, what's the best. Psychologists say that these are the best subjects to discuss when someone's nervous, and this is how you should calm someone down. Here are the signs of anxiety to look for. They were also told they were taught the physics of flight, because if people asked, they wanted the stewardesses to know how to respond. So these training manuals, just the gamut, and then you've got also, of course, the how to slice a rack of lamb, and what ingredients to put into a highball, in what order, how to serve things. So it's really.
And you said they had to be very smart.
Yeah.
Well,
they had to think on their feet.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing these stories, especially now when we are all longing to travel.
Yes.
I think this really will whet the appetites of all of us even further.
Oh, I hope so. The research took me to a lot of interesting places.
How long did you work on the book?
6 years.
Yeah. And may I ask, just what are your hopes for the book?
That's a great question. I hope that it reshapes how people think of the job. Honestly, I really hope that on a more widespread level, that these women can find their place in a really dignified and important history in the way that they actually were. The job that they were doing was dignified and important. Mm-hmm. And I think that it really, I do believe that it paved the way for younger women travelers. When they started flying in the early 60s, it was barely acceptable for women to be traveling on their own. And 10 years later, it was much more common to see groups of young women in foreign countries. And I think that this is because of them.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you. Thank you for joining us in our little virtual bookshop at Books and Books. I hope we're going to get to see you in person at some point.
I hope so too.
The next time you're in Miami, hopefully.
Absolutely.
And just a reminder to everyone that you can order the book at Books and Books, and that we would love it if you would. And again, thank you to everyone watching from everywhere. Stay safe and fly safe.
Yeah.
Fly. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody.